Hi, my name is Monica Zimmerman, and I work with the Bureau of Land Management. And I am here with Steve Chesterton with the U.S. Forest Service. And this is an interagency presentation of the Wild and Scenic River Study process. At the symposium, Nicole Gustine with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Corita Waters with the National Park Service will also be joining us so that we can provide an interagency overview of the Wild and Scenic River Study process that's going to be at the RMS Symposium in San Antonio. Next slide. The Wild and Scenic River Study process applies to all federal lands within the United States. So this slide just gives a visual interpretation of the public lands in the United States. Next slide. The Wild and Scenic Rivers Act was signed in 1968 by President Lyndon Johnson, and it establishes a national wild and scenic river system. And it complements the national policy of dam construction, because during the time in 1968, there were a lot of dams that were being constructed on rivers. And so this act helps preserve other selected rivers. With the act, at the time of the act, there were 8 rivers that were designated, and there were also 27 rivers that were identified for further study for potential inclusion in the National Wild and Scenic Rivers National System. Next slide. So to give you some perspective, there are, within the United States, there are over 35 million miles of rivers. Next slide. Out of those 3.5 million miles of rivers, 860,000 miles are either dam dredged or channelized within the United States. Next slide. And out of all of those rivers, 13,467 miles are designated as wild and scenic rivers within the United States. So less than 4.4% are designated as wild and scenic rivers under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. Next slide. In 1995, the Interagency Wild and Scenic River Coordinating Council was formed, and this council has representation from all federal agencies, Forest Service, BLM, Park Service, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And it was chartered with the goal to coordinate and bring consistency with the interpretation of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. And it is to maintain the policy for all the different agencies where there's a consistent standard for river conservation. Next slide. So some of the key points of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, specifically to the study process, identifies that there are going to be consistent or standards for adding rivers to the national system. And there are 2 authorities within the act that identifies the ability for agencies to study rivers. One is Section 5A, which is congressionally authorized studies. So these are the rivers where Congress is directing the different federal agencies to study a specific river or river segment. Section 5D1, these are studies that occur consistent with the federal land management agencies' land use planning processes. So for example, within the BLM, this would be when the BLM offices are working on a resource management plan. Within the Park Service, this would be a park plan. Within the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, this would be a comprehensive conservation plan. And then within the U.S. Forest Service, this would be a land management plan or a forest plan. So those are the 2 authorities that identifies agencies to study rivers. Next slide, please. So the study process consists of 3 steps identified on the screen. First is eligibility, and this is an objective resource inventory. And the second is classification. This is an objective land use condition inventory. So what are the conditions of the surrounding lands associated with the river? And then the third is suitability, which is an analysis of subjective factors, which Steve will go into later in this presentation, and also identifies a decision and a recommendation for rivers. So the first criteria that I wanted to look at is the eligibility criteria. And eligibility criteria consists of two things: whether or not a river is free flowing, and number two, whether or not a river or river segment possesses one or more outstanding and remarkable values. And when we look at outstanding and remarkable values, the values must be directly river related, which means that the value must be located in the river or its immediate shorelines, and that this value must contribute substantially to the functioning of the river ecosystem. And then also that the value must owe their existence or location to the presence of the river. And so that's what we mean when we're looking at directly related to the river. The outstanding remarkable value must be unique, rare, or exemplary at a region or national scale. So a region of, also referred to as a region of comparison. And a region of comparison is an administrative unit or a portion of a state, or it could be something scaled such as a physiographic or hydrologic unit. And then outstanding remarkable values are based on professional judgment, which are informed by scientific information as well as public input. So looking at the definition of free flowing, and free flowing comes directly out of Section 1B of the Act. And as one of the primary river values identified for protection, understanding what is considered free flowing is crucial for wild and scenic river study and management. I wanted to identify some key points out of the Act, where the first is it may be assumed that the same as natural flowing or flowing in a manner unimpacted by human activity. But the definition of free flowing comes right out of Section 16B of the Act, and it reads, as applied to any river or section of river, the means existing or flowing in natural condition without impoundment, diversion, straightening, riprapping, or other modification of the waterway. So what this is getting at, the existence of low dams, diversion works, or other minor structures at the time of any river is proposed for inclusion in the National Wild and Scenic River System shall not automatically bar it from consideration for inclusion. Next slide. So finally, Section 1B of the Act identifies the river-related values, and what is on your screen are the outstanding remarkable values that we must look at when we are going through the study process. So there's scenic, recreational, geologic, fish and wildlife. And when we look at fish and wildlife, specifically the fish values as well as wildlife values are looking at the populations, habitat, or the combination of these river-related conditions. Historic values are identified, cultural and other similar values. And within the Interagency Wild and Scenic River Council's study paper, there's more guidance on how to look at these different values, as well as within each of the agency's policies. There's additional guidance that should be reviewed as different offices are going through the study process. At this point, in the in-person session, we are going to take a moment to do an exercise related to eligibility. So if you could take a moment to stop the video and just think about what may rise to the level of being an outstanding or remarkable value on the river or river segment that you are studying. Next slide. So the next step in the process, now that you have identified whether or not a river is free flowing and whether or not it has at least one or more outstanding or remarkable value, you will look at the river or river segments for classification. And there are 3 classifications: wild, scenic, and recreational. And the criteria is looking at the level of existing shoreline and water resource development, access, and water quality. So for example, with wild rivers, these are rivers or sections of rivers that are free of impoundments and are generally inaccessible except for by trail, with watershed or shorelines that are essentially primitive and waters unpolluted. And so essentially they represent the vestiges of primitive America. Scenic rivers, these are the rivers or section of rivers that are free of impoundments with shorelines and watersheds that still are largely primitive and largely undeveloped, but may be accessible in some places by roads. And then the 3rd classification is recreational. And those are the rivers or section of rivers that are readily accessible by road or railroad and may have some development along their shorelines. And there may have undergone some impoundment or diversion in the place. And so once again, these the 3 classifications are identified in the white paper and other resources that are identified at the end of this module. So now I'm going to turn it over to Steve Chesterton, who is going to cover suitability.
Thanks, Monica. So the next step in the study process, as Monica referenced, is the suitability step, which is in comparison to the more objective eligibility and preliminary classification steps. Suitability has a bit more of a subjective evaluation to it to ultimately determine whether to recommend a river segment as a potential addition to the national system. And this is a process informed by the public process, including engagement with tribes and state and local governments, non-governmental organizations, and interested members of the public, as is the case with the study process in general. But this ultimately provides that basis for a federal agency recommendation for the eligible rivers and whether they are found suitable or not. And so some of the key questions that are asked as part of the suitability step are whether the eligible river and its river values identified during the eligibility process should be protected, and is wild and scenic river designation the best method for protecting those values in the river corridor. Other factors related to manageability and commitment from non-federal entities that may be playing a key role from a land ownership standpoint or otherwise in the eligible river corridor. That's another key question that is part of the intent behind the suitability process. And then ultimately, at the end of the process is a decision or a preliminary administrative decision and a recommendation to Congress for action on designation. Next slide, please. So there's actually 13 suitability factors that have been developed by the Interagency Wild and Scenic River Coordinating Council and the study and laid out in the study paper that Monica mentioned earlier, laid out in agency policies, laid out also in the 1982 Interagency guidelines for wild and scenic rivers. And these factors are rooted in the requirements of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, and as well as lessons learned from previous studies. And so you can see the schematic here on the various factors. There's actually 7 of these factors that are required to be evaluated in the suitability process, and then 6 optional factors that can be considered by the interdisciplinary team leading the process and the responsible official that will ultimately be making the decision on whether to find an eligible river suitable or not for designation. There's also oftentimes flexibility in agency policies to add additional factors to be considered beyond these 13 factors here, if that's identified as part of the process. But these are the core suitability factors that are part of that suitability process. So next is another group exercise that we'll be doing in person, and invite you to pause the presentation, and there should be a handout attached that you have access to really try to apply some of these factors in a real life scenario. And the exercise and the attachment you'll see provide some examples of input that an office might receive during the suitability process. And so if you have opportunity to take a look at that handout and think about how those examples match up with the different suitability factors on the previous slide. So as we go through the study process, we've talked about the findings of eligibility, and then the preliminary classification, and then the application of the 13 suitability factors. This is a process, in particular the suitability step, that is informed by a national environmental policy analysis, and therefore the development of alternatives of whether a segment or a river is found suitable or not suitable. And these studies can be focused on one river segment or multiple river segments across multiple rivers. And depending on the scope of your study, you'll want to have a range of alternatives developed as part of this analysis process, ranging from finding all eligible river segments that are the focus of your study suitable, to finding all of them not suitable, and then the range in between to really inform this process and the study itself. And so this is a public process, again, that results in a decision that is the federal agency's recommendation to Congress, or depending on agency policies, it may be termed a preliminary administrative recommendation. Next slide, please. So talking a little bit more about each federal river administering agency's role in this process. And again, these are the four wild and scenic river federal administrating agencies: Bureau of Land Management, National Park Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Forest Service. These agencies initiate the inventory and study process, and evaluate the rivers if directed by Congress to do so. So as Monica mentioned earlier, there's two different pathways to looking at a river for study, whether Congress has identified a river for study, or whether it's through an agency's planning processes that inventory and study process occurs. But in either case, ultimately, it's looking to identify potential additions to the national system. And for those rivers that have been found eligible, or eligible and suitable, there are protections of those river values that either Congress has asked the agencies to maintain until given time to act through a congressional study river process, or ultimately through agency policies if a river is found eligible and a suitability determination is deferred. Those protections can stay in place, should stay in place until a final suitability determination is made for any wild and scenic river. And so any actions that are implemented in a river corridor during that time of study river status, once a river is found eligible until a final determination is made, those need to protect those river values that Monica mentioned earlier, the free-flowing condition, the ORVs, as well as the water quality and river classification to maintain the eligibility and the suitability of these river segments for Congress's ultimate determination on whether they're added to the national system. Next slide, please. And so here's one example of how a study process has worked in conjunction with designation. And this is looking at the Middle Fork, Snoqualmie, and Pratt rivers on the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest in Washington. And back in 1990, those rivers were found eligible and suitable through the Mount Baker Snoqualmie Forest Plan revision process. And then after that, between approximately 2007 and 2014, there were legislative proposals developed and bills introduced into Congress proposing designations. Oftentimes there are committee and subcommittee hearings, both in the House and the Senate, where there are various witnesses asked to testify on the bill proposing designation. And then in this case, on December 19th, 2014, the Congress passed and the president signed a law that included the designation of both the Middle Fork Snoqualmie River and the Pratt Wild and Scenic River, and adding them to the national system. Now, this is one example of how the study process and designation could work, but it's not how it always works. There are thousands of miles of rivers that have been found eligible and suitable by federal agencies through these study processes that we've described, but haven't been designated by Congress. Conversely, Congress can and has designated many rivers that have not been found eligible or suitable through a federal agency study process. So ultimately, the path to designation can take a lot of different courses, but this is one example of how the study process can inform potential future designations. And so with that, let's transition to the next slide. We've got a couple additional resources for you to take a look at. It's been mentioned a couple times, the Interagency Wild and Scenic River Coordinating Council's technical paper on the Wild and Scenic River study process is available on rivers.gov. We've also got a couple online training modules focused on eligibility and suitability that you can access, along with individual agency policies, I should say, that are also available online. We've also listed here contact information for Monica and Nicole and myself, along with Corita Waters from the National Park Service, who will be part of the in-person presentation at the symposium. And we're all members of the Interagency Wild and Scenic River Coordinating Council. And then we've also have Angie Furman's contact information here. This training is part of the River Training Center's training workshops at the symposium, and Angie, as the training coordinator, plays a key role in RMS, as RMS does, in helping to provide information on a whole vast array of Wild and Scenic River training resources, including on the Wild and Scenic River study process. So with that, I think just want to say thank you for tuning in. And this just scratched the surface of the study process. I'm sure there's lots of questions out there, and please feel free to reach out to any of us with any questions or comments about what we covered today.